Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EV Ancillaries session that we're doing. It's going to be an interesting discussion. I think we're just going to wait a couple of seconds for people to join in, and then we can start. All right. I think we can begin. Uh, I'd like to, on behalf of Climate Collective, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session on EV ancillaries, looking at a new dimension in the EV revolution. Of course, this topic is very important for Climate Collective, which is looking to support startups in the climate tech space across various sectors, and of course, sustainable mobility forms a huge part of that. The sustainable mobility ecosystem in itself is growing at such a rapid rate. So it is great to be able to hear from these esteemed panelists about what is the present and what is the future of the EV ancillaries and related EV ecosystem as well. So with that, I would love to hand over to Pradeep from OMI Foundation. We want to thank OMI Foundation for kind of developing this panel along with us. Yeah, with that, over to you, Pradeep.
Yeah. Thank you, Rishi, for the introduction, and thank you, Climate Collective team, for the opportunity. It's a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining this exciting discussion on EV ancillaries, a new dimension in the EV revolution. We are witnessing a major shift in mobility where ancillary players are becoming crucial drivers for innovation and sustainability in the EV ecosystem. Today, we'll explore the opportunities and challenges for startups and investors in this space. I'm thrilled to be joined by our esteemed panelists. I would like to introduce all our panelists today. I'll start with Mr. Ivy Rao, a distinguished fellow at Terry. He brings over 36 years of experience in the Indian automotive sector, particularly in technology transfer, component localization, and alternate fuels. Having held leadership roles at Maruti Suzuki and contributed to India's automotive regulations, Mr. Rao's deep expertise in localization and innovation will be crucial to our conversation today. I would now like to introduce Mr. Karan Mehta, Principal, Green Frontier Capital. Karan brings over 16 years of experience in asset management with a focus on impact and climate investments. He has led deals across energy, water, smart agriculture, and climate tech, first with a Switzerland-based asset manager overseeing USD 4.5 billion in AUM, and now with a venture capital fund dedicated to early stage climate tech in India. His deep understanding of clean investments positions him well to discuss the opportunity for growth in the EV ancillary space. Welcome, Mr. Karan. Yeah. I would now like to introduce Mr. Alok Chauhan, Principal Misilio Fund. Alok has a strong background in investment banking and clean mobility. He's currently principal at Accelor Ventures and leads the Misilio Fund, where he focuses on clean mobility investments. Alok's experience spans from working at firms like Goldman Sachs and EY to specializing in electric mobility transactions at Unitas Capital. His insights into the investment landscape for EV ancillaries make him an essential voice in today's discussion. Welcome, Alok. I
Thank
would
you.
now like to move to our final panelist, Mr. Ankit Todi, Chief Sustainability Officer at Mahindra Group. Ankit is instrumental in shaping Mahindra's group's sustainability strategy under the Planet Positive initiative. With a background in electrical engineering and information and communication technology from IIT Delhi, Ankit has a passion for clean tech and works closely with startups to introduce innovation across Mahindra's businesses. His experience will provide valuable insights into the role of OEMs and ancillary players in building a sustainable EV ecosystem. Let's move towards the discussion now. Before that, I would like to just set the context, right? Today, we are in an important stage in the mobility space, right? We are moving towards a solution which will not only solve climate problem, but also fuel an engine of job creation, right? So today we are talking about 700 plus startups in India working on the electric mobility sector, and with a potential of over 200 billion US dollars in just in this electric mobility space that India can create, right? So we're already talking about 1 million plus vehicles. Last year in 2023, India has registered 1 million plus 50, in fact, 1.5 million electric vehicles. And this year already, in the first 8 months, we've registered over 1 million vehicles. So we're in a very good position. So the penetration is definitely doing good. But in terms of investment, in terms of the sector, I think there is a lot of scope. So today we will talk about that with the experts. So to start with, let's look at the big picture. Ankit, I would like to start with you. What role do you believe ancillary players can play in advancing sustainability in the EV sector, particularly in the battery management and end of life strategies?
Thank you, thank you, Pradeep, for having me over. And very pertinent question. As you rightly pointed out, that Mahindra has this strategy called the Planet Positive strategy, and a very important sub element of that is that anything to do with sustainability can't be done by companies standalone. In any sector, not just in the auto sector, but particularly in the auto sector, a typical OEM is what I would call a assembly plant. It brings together hundreds of different components, and especially in the ICE case it used to be some 3 to 4,000 components. In the EV case it's a bit lower, but it's all about bringing together different parts and assembling it into a functional car. So any action on sustainability also needs to involve the entire ecosystem together. So I would divide the ecosystem part into two or three parts. One is the component itself, which is all the different components, battery being a particularly big and deep area of interest. The second is also the ecosystem of the charging infrastructure, which is increasingly important. The third is also, let's say, if you take a step ahead, the EVs will become environmentally friendly only if they are charged by green energy. So there is an extension of that ecosystem to greenify the grid and this charging ecosystem to be powered by green energy, etc. So there's a lot of second order, third order implications that's there. Now when it comes to batteries in particular, the way to think about this is that uh, all the batteries that are used for EVs, there is a manufacturing related emission side of the story, and then there is the recycling or use of second life application. Now the reason why this becomes particularly important for EVs is I'll draw a comparison to ICE vehicles. If you look at the ICE ecosystem, we measure something called as scope 3 emissions. Typically for an ICE vehicle, about 90%, 85 to 90% of our scope 3 emissions is product in use. When the car runs, it burns fuel, etc. About 10 to 15% is what is product purchase emission, that all the emissions associated with the steel, the rubber, the polymer, the battery, and everything that goes into the car. The moment you look at this scope 3 emission for an EV vehicle, the numbers are very, very different, because in an ideal world, all your product in use emissions should go to zero. You should encourage the EVs are not using grid energy, but ideally using EV charging stations which are powered by green energy. So as a result, in the end state, hopefully in the future, we'll come to a situation where the product in use emissions are as close to zero as possible, which means that the product purchase emissions will end up becoming the major component of scope 3. Now that's in terms of percentages. Even if I compare them in absolute like to like numbers, then typically the product purchase emissions for the EVs are on the higher side, and that higher could be between 40 to 100% higher as well, because the battery for EVs are much larger in size and more emission intensive. And that's where a lot of work and focus is required, that how do you bring down the emission intensity, both in terms of the kind of materials and minerals that you use and the type of battery technology that you use. That's one dimension. And the second dimension is, can you bring in the element of circularity, that if you, instead of using fresh minerals every time, if you are able to create a closed loop economy, then again the emission footprint of that ecosystem goes down quite a lot. Lots of things happening in the European ecosystem. India is still not there. We are starting in that conversation. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that the batteries that are used for EVs, once let's say they are at their end of life, does not mean that they are at the stage where they should be sent for recycling immediately. Most non-stationary application batteries will have a relatively some possibility as a second life application in, let's say, storage solutions or a few other areas. So that entire ecosystem also, that how do you ensure that all the batteries come back and go for a second life application, and then in turn goes for recycling and goes to a closed loop economy. Those are the two main areas when a lot more work needs to be done. I think we are at a stage where we are understanding and trying to make this ecosystem work in India. I'll pause there.
Yeah. Thanks, Ankit. I think you set a great foundation. For sure, circular economy is important where especially the critical minerals where we have huge dependency, right? Especially in countries like Latin American, Bolivian triangle and all, right? So I'm completely aligned. But I think in terms of regulations like EU, right, which mandates manufacturers of battery, right, to take certain percentage from recycling, I think that's something that we should find a level playing field where it will help recyclers and manufacturers. I hope it comes soon in India. But now let's move to Karan, who brings a venture capital perspective on this. Karan, why are VCs increasingly shying away from investments in early stage OEMs and EV charging infrastructure, which is very important, as Ankit rightly mentioned on the charging side. So what are the fundamental barriers in these sectors according to you? Yeah.
I mean, look, the fundamental barriers is one. You don't get venture returns in investing in capital intensive businesses, right? Those are very standard 15-20% ROE sort of businesses. And you can't get the outsized venture return with a 15% or a 20% ROE sort of a business, which requires a lot of capital and capital structuring for you to be able to even earn those sort like of returns. So in general, as venture investors, and largely most venture investors would stay away from any business that requires a ton of capital, not only from a return perspective, but also from a survivability of the venture perspective, because your ability to also gain an outsized return depends on the valuation uptake, and that depends on the availability like of capital. And we've seen in the last 7-8 years, we've had 2 or 3 cycles of funding winters. So if I'm a fund that is on its last legs of my fund cycle, and I'm going through like a funding winter, and my business is capital intensive, I'm pretty much almost on the verge of writing off those businesses, right? So um it's tough. So you can't, like, we will typical venture investors would stay away. Having said that, we have invested in an OEM business, and that was more because we saw like a lot of value in what they were doing, and there was an amount of value, like also the technology that they had. The other thing that I also want to point out is, because of, like, not all OEM businesses are bad. I think today, if you asked a venture investor whether they would invest in an electric scooter company, I mean the answer is a straight no, because it would, today that market is saturated, it's commoditized. You've got about 450, 500 different brands of electric scooters in the country. You get a scooter from 25,000 bucks, like all the way up to 1,25,000. So it's just not making it doesn't give you, it's not going to give you very outsized returns. And the adoption on that curve is also sort of now plateaued. 1 in 2, like almost 1 in 2 vehicles or scooters today being sold are electric. So you want to come in early into these businesses where it's probably like a 1 in 7, and then you want to ride up that curve and be holding like a company which is probably in the top 5 of the market. So within that itself, there are different OEM businesses that we look at. We had, the way that we looked at this also was, we wanted to play a little bit of a barbell strategy, or when we looked like at OEM. So we saw value on the cargo side. We saw value on logistics, where the utilization of the vehicles are a lot higher. the economic viability, the TCOs made a lot more sense. So we took a bet over there, and it seems to be playing out the way that we want to. Uh, Similarly, with charging infrastructure, again, very capital intensive businesses. We wouldn't want to, as venture investors, we wouldn't want to put money into businesses which are setting up infrastructure, but we've seen value in connecting the demand and supply. So an investment that we've done in electric pay, for example, is a great example of that. So actually working with charging infrastructure, and being the pipe for connecting the demand and supply. So a platform digitization play which has the ability to disrupt, are things that we would look at. And again, not to take away the point that, listen, capital intensive businesses are a straight no-no in terms of actual private capital coming in. There are large investors willing to take that risk. I'll give you the standard example of ChargeZone. ChargeZone has raised a ton of money from like investors like IFC, like, etc. Those are the investors who would typically want to take that risk and are okay with those sort like of returns. But not typical venture players like us.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing those perspectives, especially the example of electric pay. I'm sure, there is market for everyone in India, and players like electric pay, which are aggregating in terms of the demand and supply, is very important. I would like to move to Alok for investment perspective. To understand, where do you see the most promising opportunities? So, Alok, what are the major risks and opportunities you see in the EV ancillary sector? We have an OEM also in the room, so we'll again check with them. But I wanted to understand from you on the investor side, what are the risks and opportunities, and how do you think this risk can be mitigated while still achieve the growth and scalability? Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Pradeep, and thanks, Climate Collective team, for having me over here. Um, to your question, I think a big evolving question for me is, what are OEMs going to do, right? You have this new technology, there's a shift in consumer behavior, there's a shift in manufacturing, there's a lot of changes that the automotive sector is going through. And I think the question of build versus buy always remains, right? On top of that, the incumbents have such large existing supply chain networks that they are able to tap into that. And these companies are to an extent cash rich, so they are able to invest into R&D and also upgrade themselves for this shift. And we are continuously seeing that, right? Tata has their own group companies that they've worked with. Recently also partnered with BMW to provide a service. The likes of tier one suppliers, like Bosch, Uno Minda, Sona Comstar, all are supplying to these incumbents and other traditional OEMs and supporting them for their shift towards the electric mobility, right? So I think that is one big, I wouldn't say risk, but like a fundamental difference in how I would look at this space from a startup's point of view, right? So you're not really just competing with other startups who are at the same stage. So it's not really a level playing field, right? On top of that, there's not really a lot from a perspective of trade barriers, right? Apart from what we had with FAME and the subsidy related barriers that we had created. But otherwise, you have a lot of European and US OEMs also already supplying and having supply partnerships with our Indian OEMs. I understand that Ather used to, I don't know whether they still do, but they used to get their motor from a European OEM. Right? So there are a lot of these nuances when it comes to the EV ancillary system space, right? And then then you also have a lot of Indian businesses that were in a different business but used their technical know-how to pivot to create offerings for the automotive space, right? The likes of Integrated Metal, etc., who are now supplying to the EV OEMs. So lastly, from the perspective of the startups who are doing something innovative, but are, of course, at the early stages of innovation have a few prototypes on their products, etc., are only getting chance to work with the long tail of OEMs, right? Where the long tail of vehicle OEMs themselves are cash strapped. So they're not able to give them enough demand or cash for them to grow or develop their technology further, etc. So this is like a vicious circle that continues to go around, which has left them in the circle of low demand, low revenues, lack of investor interest, and therefore nobody is able to grow out of that circle. Um, yeah, I guess the opportunity side, I think one theme that has played out well is um, focusing on India-centric issues, right? Because a lot of early failures were because the parts and the products were imported and they didn't really work in the Indian ambient temperatures, dusty situations, or the kind of road types that we have, etc. Right? And plus the dual use case that most two-wheelers go through, right? It's for work as well as for the personal use, right?
Yeah.
Wheelers, three-wheelers, etc. So I think from that perspective, the broader theme of indigenization and kind of making India-centric products that can also have some applicability on similar other economies like Africa and Southeast Asia, etc., would probably is an area of opportunity that I look at. Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah, great thoughts, Alok. Thanks for sharing them, especially India-centric, right? I remember like, those battery temperatures, right? The way we import those cells from China and we used to pack it like, and we've seen a lot of those incidents thanks to AI. Now they brought stricter regulations with AIS 156 2 and revised version. So I'm sure it's getting better. But I mean, as you said, like, India should focus on India centric, and we have a market for that in Africa also, right? I was in Ghana a few months back, and I've seen how electrification is picking up even in Africa, especially in commercial use case, right? So, great thoughts. Now, I would like to move to Mr. Rao now, so who has deep experience in OEMs and technology transfer. So, before we deep dive on the topic, if you could start to the audience in terms of just giving us a layman perspective on what are the components key components in are the that are there in ancillary. I'm talking about ancillary components in the EV electric vehicle that would help us, sir. Yeah.
Thanks, Pradeep. To basically talk about how auto industry operates in terms of its component requirements. Auto industry is basically a mass production system. So the numbers are very high. So anybody who starts even with the imported systems for initial manufacturing has to per se localize these parts to get advantages of cost and also flexibility in procurement. Unlike if he's going to import, there will be limitation restrictions on number of parts he has to order, lead time, etc., etc. So localization of various aggregates which are required for a vehicle manufacturing in India have to be locally available. If I go by what happened in Maruti initially started with 100% imported parts, and then gradually we had a phased manufacturing program to localize different aggregates based on various technologies available and also component manufacturing infrastructure available that time. And wherever there were gaps in technology, we had to resort to forming joint ventures to locally produce those things. And when you are localizing any part, initially the cost may appear to be high, but with once the manufacturing settles and is able to produce numbers, there is this very significant cost advantage in getting the parts locally made.
Yeah.
Now, coming to the electrification of automobiles, it has, though its requirements are similar, it is more complicated compared to IC vehicle. In the sense, the various aggregates what are required for making electric vehicle now are mostly imported, with a few exceptions. And starting with cells, though the battery manufacturing is happening in India now, almost all cells are imported. So also the electric motor. I'm not talking about two-wheeler motors, but otherwise all motors are also imported. So also the controllers, etc. The software, of course, required for battery management system or motor control, etc., are being developed locally. But however, again, the ECUs required for them are still, many of them are imported. But here the challenge is slightly different. One, right now the whole industry, EV industry, is importing most of its parts from overseas, especially mainly China. Now, when you are localizing it, you have to localize the parts and also to see the cost advantage. You have to wrap up production to big volume to get to see the advantage. Then the other more challenging requirement is you have to be cost effective when you are comparing with imports from China. There's a very big challenge. So what I feel based on my experience from Maruti is that when we are getting into localization of various systems required for electric vehicles, one has to look it from Indian requirements, Indian context, and try to optimize the whole design and also see the practical application of these aggregates being localized for meeting Indian environmental conditions, usage conditions, and also driving conditions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there is a lot of scope for optimizing various requirements, and also the spec requirements have to be relooked to get the best value out of parts which we are going to localize. There's no point just duplicating what we are importing and end of the day not achieving any cost advantage through localization.
Exactly, sir. Sir, just a follow-up, sir, here, I completely echo with you when you say economies of scale. It's not about localizing, right? It's also about, can we
Yes,
beat the quality and price with the market like China, which has already achieved globally, right? So that's something that we can't forcefully localize, sir. We need to compete with the best in terms of price and quality. So I want to understand, now we've heard from our experts in the panel, they're mentioning that it's difficult to venture into capital intensive, right? And all of these components, if I'm not wrong, are capital intensive, right? So having said that, where do you see, sir, how do you think startups can fill these gaps? We have a problem in terms of getting those funds from investors because there is risk and it's huge capital. So with all of this thing, right? So where do you see startups can help in terms of localizing, and which component do you see are low-hanging fruits out of all that you've listed? Yep.
If you look at the way the electrification of automobiles happened in India, it has been actually triggered by startups.
Yeah.
Even today, most of the legacy manufacturers of even two-wheelers like Bajaj Auto or TVS or Hero, they're still not into electric vehicle side, though they have one hour model in electric variant, but still they are not full hog into electric vehicle. So the startups have played a very important catalytic role in electrifying the automobiles in India. Now, when I mentioned that when we are localizing, we need to innovate to understand, to optimize what are our requirements and try to achieve cost benefits through localization. That can only happen through startups because the established manufacturers, either OEMs or big component manufacturers, do not have time and patience to do all these trials, which only startups can venture. I mean, if you look at the way various startups have come up and have really done well, is all through they have taken the risk. They had a very innovative idea and they try to set up those. I mean, translate those ideas into products, and they are able to do well now.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And I mean, humble request to all the investors is, yes, I mean, wherever the hardware development is involved, the capital requirements are higher. But for any investment in auto electric EV related industry, unless the hardware parts are available, nothing can work. It is not that you have software developed but not the hardware, then that will not be complete system. So somebody has to take that risk again to invest and support the startups who are, trying to localize various systems required for EVs
Yep.
and support them.
Yep. Yep.
And I just want to add the ease with which a angel investor is ready to put money into a software development, not even software, app development. They never do it for hardware. In spite of hardware startups showing them the prototypes which they have developed working well, but they have to now actually translate from so-called prototypes to actual manufacturing lots, for
Yep.
which they need investments.
Yep.
So most of the startups who have good idea, good product, good prototypes, readily available, which are also approved by ARI and ICAT, are still not able to ship to mass production or pilot production because for want of funds.
Yep.
I mean,
Got it.
this is a gap, and unless this gets
Got
bridged, what the government is planning to achieve will not happen.
Yeah, that's fair, sir. So we'll talk about collaboration. That's one of the theme of this today's discussion. Like, of course, there is a gap, but we'll also think about how can we work together, to fill this gap. I would now like to move.
I
Yeah.
just want to make like a quick
Please.
point over here.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I
please.
like what Mr. Rao said, but I also find it very it's quite interesting, right? Because as I just said, as venture investors, we're always on a clock.
Yeah.
We don't have patient capital. We are people who are looking for returns in 5 to 6 years of our investments. So unfortunately, like I would love to have a fund which can do deep tech investing, but that's not what I'm geared towards. The patient capital is actually sitting on the balance sheets of the OEMs. And I would love to actually figure out a way in which that we work with the OEMs to tap into that patient capital, and which then provides us a window to actually give them the growth capital to be able to take those innovations forward. No one understands the ancillary space better than the OEM. And for me as an investor too, I would probably want to rely on them and be like, hey, listen, guys, you all know this better than what I would. I'm happy to put the capital towards it. Y'all are more patient. Let's work together over here.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks.
No,
Thanks.
I just want to add here, like you said, you do not have so much patience to wait for startups to give returns. So also OEMs don't have patience or time to experiment on some ideas which are innovative. So they want somebody else to do the midnight oil to bring the idea to a productionable phase. Then they are ready to adopt.
Yeah. Yeah.
So expecting OEMs to get into these things is very difficult.
It's a lovely
Yeah.
chicken and eggs.
Sorry.
True. And we've seen that, right? We've seen a lot of legacy players backing up startups, right? Especially in the EV sector, a lot of legacy
Yeah, yes.
who's
Yes.
doing that support, right? So we've seen the likes of Bajaj, the Hero MotoCorp, right? All of them has invested heavily in startups in this sector. So, Karan, I mean, good that you brought that out, but I want to understand, I'm curious a little bit on, I'm sure there is some promise. Everything is not great, but for sure, there's something positive happening in the ancillary space. So wanted to understand a little bit from you on what subsectors within the EV ancillary market are showing some promise for the investors like you. Can you share some examples of startups you invested? You did mention about electric pay and what made them attractive for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, the way that I define ancillaries is the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, but the topic of conversation today is we're talking about components.
Yeah.
We have investments across the financing ecosystem, across connecting charging infrastructure, like even cab aggregator. We are an investor like in Blue Smart as well. So people who are working within the ecosystem to help the adoption of electric vehicles like on the road. But today let me just probably stick to ancillaries in terms of just components, right? And I think there's a huge promise over here. And this is one of the statements that I make, which I get like a lot of flack from a lot of people, but it's actually true. India is not a hub of innovation. We're not there yet, right? We're and as GFC, we have eyes in the West. We have partners based in New York, in Europe. So we have eyes in terms of what's happening in terms of technology in the West. And we're a little bit ahead that way in understanding how the tech adoption might play out in India, right? Or not to say that the template is always the same. India tends to also leapfrog. I'll just give you a simple example since we're talking about vehicles. We leapfrog from ICE to electric. We just left hybrid out of the window, right?
Yeah.
We did not we didn't really adopt a hybrid, and that's a whole point like of debate as well. But as to why that happened, but we leapfrog. But the point being is that we've never been a hub of innovation. What we're very good at, right, is making innovation affordable. And Mr. Rao actually spoke about cost effectiveness and quality. I think today India has that tag. Today India is able to provide affordable innovation at a very cost effective and provide the quality that is suitable to Western markets or suitable to Western OEMs. So the areas that I'm seeing a lot of interest in and I've seen are on, and look, let's just break down an electric vehicle very simply. You have a motor, you have a bunch of controllers, which is basically like ICs, it's got microchips and semiconductors. Um, and that's pretty much it. You have a battery, right? And
Battery.
on top of the battery, you have a BMS, etc., etc. But again, like the same thing, you have a bunch of chips and semiconductors, controllers, which monitor all these things, right? Today's motors are also they're not mechanical, they're more electric in in the way they're controlled, right? They're not mechanically controlled like anymore. They're more electrically controlled. You have controllers for motors as well. I see you. So they're intelligent from that aspect, right? You can control their speed, their torque, etc., without having to control the electricity flow. It's into the motor, but just basically controlling the polarities, right? So having that ability, and now let's look at the broader ecosystem. India doesn't have semiconductor manufacturing as much. We don't have microcontroller manufacturing as much. We have software. We have people who are developing software, who are making it India focused. These are all of these components. This entire vehicle is intelligent. I mean, they're pretty much going to be like cell phones. Today, Tesla is a glorified cell phone. It gives you everything that a cell phone gives you, right? So it is electronically focused, software driven. The hardware is just sort of pieces without the software make no sense, right? And potentially you would have two companies with the same hardware, but the vehicle drives completely different just because of the software, right? Or the feel of the vehicle is completely different because of the software. So today that is an area which I think is super promising, like in India, and I'm seeing a lot of startups over there actually doing a lot of work there. I'm also seeing like a lot of work on motors in India, right? So again, given how we are placed and given that we want to move away, we move away like dependence from China, etc. I'm just I'm seeing startups actually focus more on motor technologies as well, looking at new age motors, building out the architecture for new age motors, right? And their design specific to OEMs. Uh,
Yeah.
BMS batteries, I think, are really done. Now they're like I feel that they're very commoditized in terms of just a component per se. We can get into cells and cell manufacturing, but that's an entire Pandora's box, which again, like look, capital intensive, billions of dollars need to come in over there. So from a venture perspective, these are areas that I think the softwares, the controllers, building specific use cases for specific vehicles or specific class like of vehicles, and being able to sort of tweak that where I have a standard template for an Ola Electric, and I have the same template with additional features which I just need to program. It can be hot flashed like onto the same controller for an Ather, right? Not to say that they are the same thing, but I'm just using them as examples. So these are the areas where I think that are interesting from a subsector within the ancillaries for us to invest in.
Yep. Thanks, Karan. I mean, now with AI picking up, we're talking about AI-based motors and all of that. I'm sure we have an edge in software, but somehow I also feel like, the money is also, especially in the hardware, like especially when you get cells, that's where the investments. I mean, currently we're at an nascent stage, but I'm hopeful that, we'll also get into at least into the cell side of things. I would like to move to Ankit now. Ankit, as the demand of EV infrastructure goes, what do you see as key sustainability challenges? I'm talking about in terms of when we develop this associated infrastructure, right? Be it like charging infrastructure or components for that matter, right? At the end of the day, they're all intensive. Just to give you, on anode, like that's something that we've done recently, some research on anode at OMI Foundation to produce a synthetic anode, right, from derivatives from steel industry and other, it is 4x in terms of emission intensity when it comes to a natural graphite. So keeping in all of that, how do you think startups can contribute to to make this more sustainable, the transition? Yeah.
Absolutely, Pradeep, and absolutely loving the discussion and viewpoints from everyone. So let me again go back to the same point that there are two parts of optimization from a sustainability perspective for EVs. The most impactful part is the charging infrastructure only, and I'll give you some data that a typical ICE vehicle over its lifetime, any four-wheeler ICE vehicle in Indian road conditions has an emission intensity of about 35 tons of carbon dioxide. Now, if you were to look at a equivalent, EV vehicle in the current grid condition, which is roughly 77-78% coal part, about 22% renewable energy part, the emission goes down by about 15 to 20%, not very significantly. But at the same time, if you were to have a 50%, green grid, then the numbers go down by another 30% or so. And if you were to have a completely green charging ecosystem, 100% renewable energy charge, then only the emission intensity goes down from 35 tons to about 8 to 9 tons, which is about roughly 80% reduction. So the entire impact from an environmental perspective, from a shift to ICE to EVs will only happen when you have the charging infrastructure, which is green energy powered. So that's the most important area. Now, Mahindra directly is not investing in charging infrastructure, at least not yet. But very recently, we actually appointed a fairly senior leader as the head of our charging infrastructure business, because from Mahindra's portfolio perspective, most of our, the born electric portfolio. So we currently have some EV vehicles, but these are mostly, the same platform being converted into EVs. But the born electric, as we call it, all of those vehicles are going to start hitting the market only early next year onwards, and that's where we are investing to work with the entire startup ecosystem, not just a startup ecosystem, I would say the entire charging ecosystem, which again is to a large extent dominated by startups as well as the large players, to figure out how we can work together. So the approach here is a partnerships approach rather than anything else, and that is what will really be an enabler from a sustainability perspective. On the
So,
other,
Ankit,
yeah.
sorry to cut you, but I have a follow-up question to you on this. Like we're talking about 100%, greening the grid kind of a thing, repowering the charging infrastructure with a solar or a renewable energy. But don't you think that will increase the capital? Already, we're talking about EV industry as a capex intensive, right? If you bring the solar again on top of a charging station, right? It's again an additional capital, right?
No,
So,
so not necessarily, Pradeep. I think there's, and this is where a lot of partnerships and innovation come into
yeah,
play. If you were to look at the cost of electricity as an operational cost for the charging station, buying electricity, roughly in most states in India would cost you about 10 rupees, 9 to 10 rupees a unit
yeah,
in commercial rates. But if you were to buy that electricity in the form of green energy, it actually costs you about 4 to 5 rupees. So
yeah,
the ROI of investment on green energy is actually significantly superior, and
yeah.
in fact, the business case and break-even period for your core charging infra capex goes down quite a bit, the lower the cost of the electricity that is. The other part is that you have a variety of service providers, again, depending on the size of the requirement and size of the charging infrastructure that you're putting together, where you can outsource that problem and just buy on a OpEx model renewable energy. Or if you have the right scale and size, do what are these group captive projects. So if they are of a certain scale and size, so there are enough. I think that part of the problem is actually a solved problem, and in fact will be an enabler for the charging ecosystem to break even sooner than later. And Karan, I think, pointed out to one of the investments, Blue Smart. So I know, have been in touch with the team there, and they have been able to convert their entire charging ecosystem into green energy part. So that part in my mind is a very easy to solve problem, and should be a must do, not even an optional thing. In fact, that will make the charging ecosystem break even much quicker. Uh, the second part I was touching upon, and I'll keep it very brief, is as I said, on the battery side, that is where I feel that a lot more work has to be done. So at least from our end, because the volumes are not there yet, and as I said, end of life batteries for EVs will come up in a big way only a few years down the line. We are still catching up in terms of the sales and the numbers, etc. But some early partnerships have been made with the battery recyclers. So most of them startups again. So most of these partnerships have been made where we will mostly be aggregating and supplying. And currently the batteries that we have are actually the batteries which are more during the manufacturing process itself, extra batteries that come out, or some work in progress batteries that have to be discarded. So those kind of things are the only volumes that's there, but over a period of time that volume will really scale up. And again, I think the partnership approach with innovative startups, high material recoverability, the right cost, the right infrastructure, etc. So I would say that as OEM, the sustainability in the EV ecosystem only will happen when you have the ancillary ecosystem ready to support all these kind of requirements. Material circularity is another area, but I think that's a bit more common to ICE and EVs. It's just that it's getting a bit more traction in the EV ecosystem because of the entire focus on sustainability being stronger. So yeah, let me pause there.
No, thanks for sharing. In fact, and I think any government support, right? Especially like bringing open access, right? Where you can source power, they've reduced the bar in open access. I think those kind of interesting policy support is helping in terms of making the grid greener for charging infrastructure. And now government is talking about TOD, incentives if you do charging infrastructure during solar hours, right? Like powering your vehicles during solar hours. That's something that's also picking up. Thanks for sharing your perspectives, Ankit. Let's talk a little bit on the policy and the government support. I would now like to move to Alok, right, from Misilio. Alok, let's talk about the government, right? So, what policy reforms or government initiatives would encourage greater support for EV ancillary startups? How important is policy alignment in building investor confidence in this sector? Yep.
Is it? Thanks, Pradeep. I think this is government has done fairly a good and a focused job in terms of where policy sits and how it kind of gives impetus to innovation locally, right? And I think obviously the main FAME or PME drive, as it's called now, is something where I think they've pushed quite a bit on localization and indigenization of things, right? Of course, there was a point when it was exploited, but I think it's still in play. It's important for companies who are building in India to avail those subsidies and bring the cost down for the end consumer. They need to have a certain degree of localization. I think that gives a lot of opportunity for local players in the country. The auto PLI is to the tune of 225,000 crores, also includes component manufacturing, right? So that also plays into the entire ancillary play. Day before, I think with ANRF launched their first two schemes. Among the first two, the Maha EV initiative is there for development of essential EV components, right? So they are focusing on batteries, cells, power electronics, motors, chargers, etc. So I think overall the government has done a fairly good job, very focused very driven, and I think with a clear goal in mind to transition. Having said that, I mean, from an investor perspective, of course, policy is very important, but you don't want to be completely reliant on policy to make business sense, right? I mean, it's great to get that initial push, great to get that initial foot in the door, great to get that support and protectionism a little bit, right? But you can't be fully reliant on that. So it's a good launch pad if treated as launch pad. But beyond that, I think it's important for company to have its own business sense and economics to work out on its own. Because all of these programs are always going to be like short term. They're not going to be like in existence forever. So as an investor, I would look for, I mean, whenever we speak to our companies and all that, we always encourage them to take full advantage of these programs in whatever way possible. But of course, look beyond to create its own legs.
Yep.
I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alok, for sharing. I think very interesting points. Definitely, I was just reading some news. There is some phase manufacturing program that the government has released a draft for comments, even on the charging components as we speak today. So that's something that is live today, and it's open for comment from the industry. If anyone would like to, please comment. Please check out MHI's portal. I would also encourage the audience. I think you're enjoying the discussion today. I could see 3 questions already. I'll open for Q&A in like 10 minutes from now, but I would want to see more questions coming. We have some really, really interesting panel members here coming from the industry, investors, and also from sustainability perspective, right? So please, post your questions. I want to actually have this session interactive. So please, I can also see Karan responding. So feel free. I would encourage panelists to also respond to the questions. I would like to now move towards Ivy Rao, sir. Sir, if you see PLI, right? PLI for ACC, there is some criticism. I'm like in terms of saying that those policies are not startup friendly. When I say not startup friendly, like for example, to apply for PLI for ACC, the amount of money that the government has put in, right? Like the clause is very high. I think it's in the tone of more than 500 crores, if I'm not wrong, like to even apply for the PLI for ACC. But if you look at Europe, sir, there is a program by like in Europe, I forgot the name, but to encourage startups in the battery space, right? They've pumped in huge amount of money, especially if you talk about startups in the battery. I mean, of course, Northvolt may not be the very good example, but there are a lot of startups which have enrolled in that program, which has helped build some momentum in the battery manufacturing space in Europe, sir. So I think it's the Horizon program, if I remember correctly. Wanted to understand from you what could be better from the government. Of course, demand side, yes, this amazing support with PME5 coming in and all, but in terms of encouraging specifically startups on the component side, what do you think the government should do? They're doing good, but what could be better? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Alok when he said the government has taken a lot of initiatives to support EV penetration in Indian auto industry. Also, government has come out with the PLI scheme to support the localization of various aggregates for electric vehicles. But there is a feedback from a lot of, especially startups or low volume manufacturers who said that the PLI scheme does not support them in getting funds from the government if they don't qualify with the whatever expected turnover of the organization, etc. Having said that, government in last 5, 6, or maybe 10 years is aggressively promoting startups, and there are lots of incubation centers all over the country where they are incubating various startups with bright, innovative ideas. But somehow, I mean, I am in panel some of these incubation centers as a mentor. My interaction with the startups, I mean, this is happening for last 4, 5 years now. I somehow get a feeling that incubation centers have become, I have come reached a stage where they don't know what they should do now. I mean, in the sense, as I mentioned earlier, most of the startups with these ideas are stuck when they have reached the phase where they have to translate their product to mass manufacturing. And also, a lot of startups are stuck for getting their products evaluated by ARI, ICAT, which also requires a lot of funds for certification. In these issues, the incubation centers are not able to support startups. This is my personal opinion. I somehow feel that all incubation centers, as a policy, should review what they are doing, what needs to be done, looking at what is the current status of startups whom they have actually incubated over last 5 6 years. I think that would give a very clear indication of what is the requirement of the startups in various areas, and how these incubation centers can really accelerate these startups to reach their goals.
Yep. Very interesting. Yeah. Do you want to add something, sir? Yeah.
Yeah, I had been raising this issue with in lot of these panel discussions and other forums also, but somehow nothing has really happened.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point is the incubation centers, could revisit, how they can support in terms of the electric mobility startups, in terms of getting those homologation approvals on time, because that's a bit a painful process, right? To getting those approvals from ARA and ICAT, it can take months. I hope government can.
No, time is one issue, but money required for
Yes.
certification is another issue.
Yes. There are some rules, like if you're a retrofitment player, right? You need to get approval each time you retrofit a vehicle, right? So I think there.
Retrofitment as a proposal has many other
Yeah,
issues
of course, that's a.
which needs government intervention to
Of course.
clearly define what should be retrofitment
Yes, sir.
and how they can really facilitate the manufacturers who have developed retrofitment kits
Yeah.
to actually do the required conversion of existing vehicles to electric vehicles.
Yeah. That's that. I just thought of sharing one example where there are some lot of regulatory things also. It's not always about physical demand, but also in terms of regulatory things where government can speed up, which will help startups, especially who are in the early stage. I would now like to make this a cross panel kind of a thing. So which means it's open to any one of you. We've heard challenges from startups. We've heard about investors, right? We also Ankit did mention about the sustainability side of things, right? So now I would like to, let's think about a collaborative side. How do you think OEMs, startups, and investors can work together to enhance the growth of EV ancillary sector in India? This is open to any one of you. Yeah.
If I can, sorry, go ahead also.
No, over to you.
Yeah,
Please.
Alok, you can start, then Rao sir can add. Yeah.
I mean, purely from a perspective of how I see this evolving, at least as from an investor's point of view or someone who's an interested party, it is of course that as we started discussing as well, India-centric innovations that can be replicated in other markets as well in order to expand your market size, right? And kind of get a share of that pie. It will lead to creation of some initial moat, expand market, and also India exports a good amount of vehicles, and I think getting that pie also is a would be a great thing. Uh, Also, instead of directly working with vehicle OEMs, you can also explore working with, say, the tier one suppliers of these OEMs, because at times you are able to better partner with them, package a product and sell it to the end OEM, where there might be better opportunities for you to scale, also create potential exit. Like from an investor perspective, that would be a great plus point. I think the other thing that I would say is that there are a lot of upstream innovations that you can look at. So as I was when we were discussing earlier, right? So materials innovation, right? So a lot of end products and their ancillary components. A lot of startups are working in materials innovation and other areas where what goes into those ancillaries or components, etc., is being improved upon in order to make the end product more efficient, better productivity, better safety, etc., etc. Right. And I think lastly, also, I would see a lot of these ancillary components have applicability in outside of automotive, right? So if you have a product that can work across industries, could also be an open could also be an option for you to expand market size and have a better scale up plan overall if you're targeting multiple industries. Of course, all of this is given that you have that startup capital, you are able to prove out your product, work with multiple industries, and those challenges remain across the board. I don't think you can really solve for those base fundamental challenges as a hardware tech company.
Yeah. Yeah. Rao sir, do you want to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the time when we need very strong collaborative approach between academia, the industry, and maybe startups. Industry, I mean the existing manufacturers. Here, I agree with Alok where he said maybe tier one component manufacturers may be a better partner than OEMs. I know of some startups who had developed some products and they literally try to get audience with most all OEMs to actually use their technology onto the products what they are already making so that they can go to the market faster. And none of the OEMs was ready to experiment that. And also they did not support them also. So what I'm saying is somehow I get a feeling that whenever a startup goes with some technology, what he developed to a OEM existing manufacturer, they consider him as a competitor, or in some cases they ridicule the startup saying that we already know this technology, etc., etc. So I think we should try to cultivate an atmosphere where the OEMs come forward and support the startups with good ideas, so that the idea actually gets implemented and comes out with a more efficient system or part or a vehicle, whatever. Unless that happens, I don't think the startups will really. Development of startups will not happen the way we want them to. I think startups have their own set of problems, and from their side, they also should be aggressive and try to do things systematically and try to get the existing manufacturers support them. That's still not happening. I mean, there are few exceptions where Hero Motors has supported Ather Energy, etc., but not many cases.
Yep. Thank you, sir. I think it's been a fascinating discussion so far. So let's go to the Q&A. I think the Q&A room is now getting busy. So I'll just read some open questions as we speak. Like there's one question from Mr. Amit Agarwal. His question is, I understand the lithium mining from Nevada and other drought-prone areas in America draw a concern that electric battery revolution in America will require billions of gallons of water to mine lithium, which in a way would spike up the price. Will this impact the Indian EV market, and how sustainable can the supply chain get going forward? It's open to anyone, but yeah. Ankit, do you want to pick this up? Yeah.
I mean,
Sorry, where can I read the question again?
The question is on the Q&A. It's in the open.
Puneet, no, which question are you referring to?
This is Amit Agarwal's.
The first one. First one.
Yeah. In the meantime, Karan, do you want to respond? Yeah, you're saying something.
I mean, let's face it, lithium mining is a horribly polluting industry. I think, okay, the long story of it, I think we will continue to see an a development cycle of batteries and cells, which will happen. I draw a parallel to what we saw with processors in the early 90s, actually through the 90s. So we will continuously see a change in the way lithium cells evolve. The amount of lithium that is also being used in batteries being reduced, different materials coming in. Um, and also at the same time, new cell chemistry is being developed. So there was also like a question on like what about heavy transport? Today, lithium does not answer that question. It's near to improbable that you can have a heavy transport vehicle doing a 600-kilometer track without like sufficient charging, fast charging infrastructure or proper like charging infrastructure and a battery pack that can actually support it. So it's still a bit far-fetched. So a lot of things are going to change. And I think with that, but the question specifically is that what's going to happen to prices with this. Like, look, it's anyone's guess, to be honest. Today, most of the cell prices are actually controlled by China. We'll have to see what happens. We've already seen cell prices crash tremendously in the last year or so. So, like, will this one factor, water use, be an issue which affects prices? Yeah, but uh, intuitively, yes. But uh, but yeah, it's just like a wait and watch. I really don't know what to say about that. But yeah, we will see. We will definitely see lithium sort of uh in general sort of also going like away once we see newer chemistries and like better technologies on lithium cells also evolve.
Yeah, thanks, Karan.
Pradeep,
Ankit, yeah, Rahul,
Pradeep,
yeah, yeah.
I just want to add to what Mr. Karan has said. Terry has done some life cycle analysis of IC vehicles in comparison with EVs.
Mm-hmm,
And there they had taken up some 8 different parameters impacting sustainability
mm-hmm.
and saw how these parameters perform with the IC vehicles and the EVs. And as this question indicates, water is one of the major issues with EVs compared to ICs. Uh,
Yeah,
so, I mean, this is I mean, so whenever you are talking about electric vehicle adoption as the best option for low carbon uh, option, we have to be careful because we cannot forget other important parameters which are
the food.
impacted by, I mean, electric vehicle adoption, say lithium being mined and which consumes so much water, etc. So we have to be careful and we have to have a balanced approach towards what we are going to do and say that it is sustainable and
Exactly, sir.
environment friendly.
Definitely. Thanks
So
for sharing.
generally we talk about only CO2, but
Yeah,
CO2 is not the only parameter which
of
impacts
course, we need to
environment.
talk about the water.
So we have to consider all the parameters.
Thank you, sir. Ankit, do you want to quickly add something? Yeah.
Yeah, no, completely echo with what Karan said and what Mr. Rao also said. That on one side, I think the ecosystem, the chemistries of the batteries will evolve. That's one side of the story, and you'll see, more less environment intensive minerals being used for batteries. That's one. The second is the extension of the batteries. As I said, not just looking at them as EV batteries, but looking at them for multiple applications so that you increase the life and spread out the impact. The third is circularity, which is going to be increasingly important. So one of the examples I was talking, Europe is coming up with this concept of battery passport where everything can be tracked essentially. Next week, I'm attending an event where a similar idea is being discussed in India, backed by Nandan Nilekani. The way he's revolutionized UPI and financial ecosystem, he's looking to do something, or at least starting a conversation on batteries around this. So something, an innovation in that direction will be really helpful. And to Mr. Rao's point, I would just add that both from Mahindra's perspective and for all OEMs perspective, we have actually taken a very conscious call to not make sustainability only about emissions. In fact, the entire strategy that we have, the planet positive strategy, we very specifically talk about all environmental impacts, you have to look at emissions, you have to look at water, you have to look at waste generation, you'll have to look at the kind of material that you use, right from recycled material, recyclable
Yeah.
material, low emission material, green steel. So it's a very holistic conversation that one needs to invest and think, and then accordingly also make it profitable. Because unless and until it's profitable and makes business sense, things won't really pick up at scale. So both those things.
Thanks. Just to add a little bit, there's something called minerals MSP that India has signed with US. Like what's going to happen is that countries like India and the group of MSP countries are strategically finding places to identify those mines which are relatively better in terms of sustainability. So they're looking at places where we can mine this sustainably. So that's something that is coming up, as Ankit mentioned. We're going to have a very soon we're going to see a footprint on each batteries, right? So when you purchase a battery, it will talk about like, what is the footprint of that battery. So there is a battery clone where you will type that battery serial number and the entire data gonna come. So that's something EU is picking up, and battery passport. I'm sure I want to see that in India, and even tracing it, right? Where did you get that battery? Where's the lithium source from? Where that processing happened? All of that, right? That is something that we will see very soon in India. That's something that we might address it. But in terms of price point, there's a lot of research happening on new chemistries like sodium ion and all of that. So that's also a way where we can reduce the footprint. World is moving towards LFP also in terms of lithium ion chemistries, which has less dependency on minerals like cobalt and all, right? So that's something that we are seeing. But there's some really interesting questions coming up. This one, yeah, Alok,
Just,
quickly on
just,
something.
just to kind of round up, right? I mean, as long as resources are being utilized, these resources are finite, and they'll always will be taken away from something else, and the cost will again then depend on demand and supply of all of these things. However, circularity, as Ankit mentioned, is going to be key, because
Yeah.
as long as you're able to bring these back into the chain or the entire cycle, that will make a lot of difference. And I think that's something that we as an investor also hold very dear to us, that it's an important piece of the entire EV ecosystem, which really needs to come in its own, until and even beyond, because our lack of cell manufacturing gives us that inability to kind of do this cost management of these entire minerals, and we'll always be import dependent if we don't start producing these locally as well. So I think recycle becomes very important for India as well.
Yeah, sure. Of course, like, we will see 100 gigawatt for sure in 2 years or 3 years coming up in India. So I would encourage investors like you to also talk about recycling, because after that, we need someone in the market who can recycle those manufacturing scrap. But let's move towards another question. Puneet,
Pradeep, I just want to add one point to what Alok said.
Yeah.
If you go back to the government's initiative of electrification of automobiles, mobility, their, ultimate goal was that we will switch to electric vehicles even with imported lithium, making the batteries, etc. But unlike crude imports, which would exponentially increase with the number of vehicles coming into the market, one day the lithium imports are likely to come down if we have very strong, foolproof recycling system set up, so that the lithium extracted from the used batteries will get to the manufacturing of new batteries. And thus, the imports are likely to come down at some point of time. I mean, I don't think it will happen in next 1 decade or so, but it will. Theoretically, it should happen, provided we are able to electrify the vehicles and they are acceptable to the customers, and the penetration should be much higher than what it is now.
Yeah, exactly, sir. Definitely, definitely. So just in the interest of time, I don't want these questions unanswered. There's one question from Puneet, like in terms of we want to understand, like, to make the EVs viable, we really need to push from other technologies, component manufacturers, make in India or PLI to cut down. Do you think that's possible? Like he's talking about if I'm not wrong, like, the component localization, is that possible in India? Do we have examples in India where component localization is happening? If anyone want to pick this up, I mean, it's not about the software. I'm talking about the hardware side of things.
Yeah.
So do you see anything happening in India in the component localization?
Alok, you raised your hand, so I'm going to let you go first.
Sure. Thanks. So I think overall, see, with the number of components being lesser, of course, more complicated, there's a lot more electronics, etc. But overall, the components being lesser, comparatively, we've seen if you remove the cost of the battery, the vehicles are much cheaper, right? At the cost of battery, you're actually paying for fuel to a great extent, right? I think what MG recently did, and I think with the evolving financing mechanics that might evolve, because everybody is now exploring that, right? And there was some article about Tata exploring that, and I think eventually, if this becomes like a thing that customers adopt, it will be a great I think it will be a great step towards a push towards adoption from a customer's point of view. That's solving for one problem, right? Which is the cost of acquisition. I think from a OEM perspective, you've solved for how you sell the product and how you make it attractive to the end consumer. Uh, Eventually, the bigger problem is the range and the product, because we are mostly one vehicle household. Generally, either you have like a one four-wheeler, one two-wheeler, very few households that have multiple two four-wheelers, right? So you can't really push a product that is applicable for a certain set of use cases, right? Like, I mean, I agree. Like, even a single household would probably do 95% of the trips within the city where EV is all good, right? But what about that 5%? Because everyone wants to solve for everything there is, right? So eventually that needs to be solved as a another hurdle for adoption. But as far as the cost of acquisition goes and the cost of making this vehicle attractive to the end consumer goes, I think a lot of this will be solved by the financing mechanics of it.
I just want to add to that I think like today there is no difference. And I go back to my example of scooters. Like almost 1 in 2 scooters today being sold as electric. You're getting scooters from 20,000 bucks all the way up to 1,25,000. You've got a wide range to choose from. So you've got scooters that are competing with ICEs already. And it's not a choice anymore. And I'm also seeing that for four-wheelers, for passenger cars. It's not a choice like anymore of an ICE versus an EV just basis a price. It is now like, okay, you know what? I'm going to actually use this. It's going to save me money right through my use, and that's where the value from a customer perspective is being driven. We're seeing that story like even play out for commercial vehicles, where the fleet operators are seeing a tremendous amount of value and their bottom lines improve just by adding more EV vehicles on their fleets. So it's not like a choice anymore. Yeah, like of course, batteries are 40-50% of the cost of the vehicle, but if I take down an ICE, there'll be one component, and I don't know I'm sure Mr. Rao can add to this, but I'm sure there's one component, just say hypothetically the engine, which is probably 30% of the cost of the vehicle. But that's just the way the vehicle is designed. That's just a design problem, right? So until we have electric vehicles, until we're using cells, we will have the cost of the vehicle be predominantly dependent on the battery. And we're also seeing battery prices have like already come down. So it's not a question of like, listen, am I actually paying a little bit more? It is now that, listen, this vehicle is actually is in the 2-3 year, 4-5 year, like a life of me using it. It's actually gonna like net save me like a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Karan and Alok, for sharing your perspectives. Alok, I want to ask you this question from Avinash. I mean, Karan did answer this during our discussions, but I wanted to understand from Nisilio perspective and Ancillaries, venture, in terms of what kind of ancillary components you're looking forward to investing in. So maybe let's talk about 2 years or 3 years from now, or yeah.
So we are in the midlife of our fund, right? So we're now in our 5th year, closing in on the fifth year, right? So we've made our investments, at least as far as the deep tech and hard tech solutions are concerned, right? So we've made investments in batteries, drivetrains, cell design, materials, recycling, and some software areas, right? So we've made those investments broadly. We would have liked to make another investment in, say, motors. We tried to look around quite a bit, but we couldn't really cross the line on making that investment. That's an area that I think now I don't think I will be able to support that investment, but that's an area that I would have invested if I had the time and on my side.
Yep. Thanks, Alok, for sharing that. So we have one more question from Kedar. So I want to ask Mr. Rao, sir, on this. Like, what role do you think will additive manufacturing and advanced materials like metal composites and meta materials will play in improving performance in EVs?
As far as automobiles are concerned, not specifically for EVs, but even otherwise, one of the most important areas where a lot of research and development happens is to reduce the weight. And all these composite materials, etc., would help. One of the options for reducing the overall weight of the various systems that are used for automobiles. So, I mean, whenever a new product gets developed, I think there are various ways and means of optimizing the weight of various systems. And weight reduction is one of the important requirements whenever a new model gets developed. I mean, to give a very good visible example is the Maruti has now, as of now, launched 3 generations of Swift. If you compare the latest Swift, it is lighter than the previous generation, and that is lighter than the second generation, and the first generation was the heaviest. And they were able to do it without impacting the customer interaction requirements like overall passenger space, etc., etc. So overall size has been optimized and weight has been reduced, and without sacrificing on any of the performance parameters for the customer. So whenever a new model gets developed, is one of the most important areas where one of the important parameters for uh, in design, weight reduction and the number of component reduction, etc.
Yeah, Alok, yeah, please.
So I think to Rausa's right. So I mean, there of course a lot of one of the companies that we had spoken to earlier had built a chassis that was 70% lighter, right, and would lead to overall weight reduction. But in EVs, that basically means a multifold improvement in the product's efficiency, right? As long as the other performance metrics I mentioned, you can use a lighter battery, you can use a or the same size of battery can give you a much longer range.
Yeah, of course.
And overall, systems improve multifold by small improvements and materials. One of our portfolio companies build single wall carbon nanotubes, essential for the silicon anode batteries to improve their stability and efficiency overall. So I think that's what when I was mentioning that you go upstream, right, and there are a lot of innovations happening there that are able to further help the efficiency and productivity of the end product.
Yeah, perfect. Ankit, please come in. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, just seconding what Mr. Rao and Alok said, but just adding one more point that, in India, the EPR or for end of life vehicle recycling is coming from next year and it will hopefully scale in a big way. And additive manufacturing in general can be a very big enabler for getting many of these components back into the supply chain. So you don't, at least for parts which are not visible and go inside the car, using additive manufacturing and a lot of these processes, you can actually get the same component back into the value chain. So there's a lot of cost optimization as well as from a sustainability perspective, make the entire end of life vehicle ecosystem also profitable. There's a lot of opportunity there. It's just that it'll take a lot more time because I think you need a certain volume of the similar type of vehicles and similar type of components to come back into the market. I was in US last year by chance and happened to visit a General Electric locomotive factory. So they do this very efficiently in the locomotive ecosystem because everything comes to the same company for remanufacturing. So that entire concept of remanufacturing in the auto sector is still something that we are a bit, maybe half a decade to a decade away from, but lots of opportunities in that space.
Very interesting. I'm sure remanufacturing will be the buzzword very soon, like, with the batteries going for a second life and repurposing, there'll be a lot of batteries, someone needs to repurpose it and reuse it. Just in the interest of time, I would like to quickly summarize this insightful discussion. It's been truly an honor, to be part of this session with esteemed panelists like you. We've discussed multiple things, right from the sustainability side of things, how important sustainability in terms of component localization. We also talked about the issues about investor side of things, right, on the capital side, and how the interest for software industry is picking up, especially in the startups and component side. We also heard about from Mr. Rao sir about the gap between OEMs and startups, and that needs to be filled, right? And Alok did broaden some very interesting perspectives on how are they supporting components, including battery manufacturing, like silicon anode that he mentioned right now. And we also talked about the importance of circular economy, repurposing, and remanufacturing and all of those. Thank you so much. I would now like to hand over it back to Climate Collective team for any closing things here.
Yeah, so on behalf of Climate Collective, I'd like to thank all the panelists and specifically Pradeep specifically moderating the session. And also it was very, very insightful. So one thing that I believe after this discussion that EV ancillaries remains a very big opportunity to tap from the investor's point of view as well. Yeah, so thank you for the session. And one announcement for the founders, like if they're looking forward to raise funds, then they can reach out to us. So they can find the mail IDs in the chat box. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're on time. Yeah.
Thank you, Pradeep.
Thanks, Pradeep.
Thanks,
Thank you.
It was great hearing.
Thanks,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Rao. Thanks, Ankit. Thanks, Alok.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Pradeep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
It was great being part of this. Bye.